Rights are to be taken, not requested. Seized, not begged for. These words were spoken by Jose Marti over 100 years ago in his fight against Spanish rule, and these words are ones which we must reflect on with great seriousness in the events of today. The United States, slowly then rapidly, has abandoned its liberty, abandoned its morality, and abandoned its soul. As things stand now, to remain part of the United States would consist of being shackled to a corpse, bound by an object which only serves to weigh us down. We have witnessed how in the span of only a few months, even the rights considered most basic have been pushed to their breaking point, strained as the government attacks their easy targets before they will inevitably and predictably move on to everyone else. Within the past few weeks, the United States has made a habit of violating these rights, ignoring court orders and daring the judiciary to act. And the most terrifying part of it all, that millions respond to this not with shock and horror, but with callous cheers. We have been reduced to begging, filled with joy anytime the government cools their attacks and pays lip service to the rights that we are entitled to. But no matter what the government says, let us remember that if for even a second freedom of speech does not apply, and if for even a second due process is not entitled to all, then these inalienable rights suddenly become quite cheap. It has come to the point where we have to truly ask ourselves, what is the point of remaining part of this country? And to that, I respond that there is no point at all. There is no future in the United States. The path this country is going down is one that leads only to ruin, and it do us well to stand up and take what is ours rather than being dragged down with it. Hatred has taken root across this nation, and it has driven a barrier right through the center of it. When neighbors become enemies, and when millions have to fear arbitrary arrest or deportation, notwithstanding the abuse they face even without direct persecution, we arrive at the reality that this nation has ceased to be one where all can be equal. Instead, the government attempts to exploit fear and hatred to make targets of people's lives, ripping apart families and destroying communities, all for the personal benefit of politicians whose only ticket into office is a state of perpetual fear. I hardly need to explain the infamous cases of obscene abuse, the deportation of Mahmoud Khalil, the arbitrary detention of Abrego Garcia, along with thousands more who had their visas revoked and threatened with immediate detention for the crime of anti-government speech. These cases are horrific in every sense of the word, and a worrying sign for any who want to live a life free of constant oversight and government surveillance. But once again, the most worrying sign of all is the sound of the crowd, either stunned into silence or whipped into a vengeful frenzy. All the government needs to do is say that these men are terrorists, anti-state actors attempting to destroy the great nation of America, and millions will cheer on with all the strength they can. The current regime has pushed the boundaries of decency so far that whether to give due process to a man they admit is innocent is now considered a reasonable debate, and the idea that even those who are truly criminals must be given the due process guaranteed by our Constitution is now considered a radical idea. Reality is no longer important, and all the government needs to do is say a few phrases and anyone can become a justifiable target. One of these events is an outrage, but multiple of them is a pattern, and it is time we stop being outraged and start looking for permanent solutions. It has become clear that this is not a phase, some transient movement that'll go away in the midterms through the power of the status quo, but rather a fundamental shift in the character of this country. We are approaching truly dark times, and it will soon become a national shame that will hang over us for decades to come. I believe, quite frankly, that we should play no part in this. A nation is only worth what it can bring to its people. It should only continue by their consent, and never be justified by its own existence. The United States is no longer worth the ink it takes to print the flag. If we are to seriously consider the creation of a new nation, we must always remember the fact that a nation is only legitimate through its people, not the other way around. An independent California is now a necessity, but it is one we must take on with great seriousness. A nation is not some force of nature, but rather a social construction, and we must think of the construction of this nation in the same way one would think of any construction, with specific blueprints and a plan of action to get it built. But before I discuss what a Californian nation should look like, I need to discuss every aspect of our character that the United States is ripping apart. California is a land that contains multitudes, but the United States seems to have a desire to forcefully impose a false American identity to smother that. Border agents from the opposite side of the country line the walls in San Diego and Calexico, treating with contempt any who have connections to our brothers and sisters of the South. This was the case even before the current administration, and it has rapidly went from the spiteful to the vengeful, as the already great power they had has now been increased 1,000 times. Immigration agents now rampage our state, grabbing people off the street and holding elderly women at gunpoint simply because they can. The lines of cars crossing back and forth between Tijuana and San Diego now lay empty, that lively connection now replaced with a quiet terror. As our land is paralyzed, we send our paychecks to the federal government as they happily take our money and use it to fight against their own interests. And while we pay far more than they pay us, it seems that we still do not give enough, as the federal aid legally entitled to us apparently is not so guaranteed. In the wake of one of the greatest disasters in our state's history, the president demands that we give more, not only economically propping up the United States, but also falling into its party line. We are being extorted by the government, coerced into changing our laws to receive the money that belongs to us in the first place. And Sacramento, in all their haste for a negotiated settlement, has stood still in the hopes the federal government will somehow overlook the fact that we are fundamentally opposed to them, and perhaps toss us some aid if we beg politely enough. This relationship is broken beyond repair. With the current state of things, anything other than separation will be surrender. The United States is sliding into tyranny, and we will become a part of that black spot if we do not act soon and decisively. Still, while our grievances are long and profound, grievances alone do not make a new nation. Just as important as what we stand against, it is necessary to define the basic principles that we must stand by. Any Californian nation must recognize the fundamentally international, cosmopolitan nature that comprises it. The United States was ultimately torn apart by nationalism and fear, slowly but unceasingly putting vengeance above liberty and pride above human dignity. Any society, at its base and when functioning properly, ultimately seeks a better, freer, and more comfortable life for its people. It'd do us good to recognize that basic function above all else, lest we be clouded by all the hateful distractions which can get in the way. What matters should not be one's race, background, gender, or beliefs, but rather the simple fact that they call California their home. To that aim, the national identity which you must construct should be a fundamentally open one, permitting all to seek the best life that they can regardless of those who wish to keep them down. The hatred towards foreigners and immigrants which came to define the United States must be avoided at all costs, both for reasons of basic decency and for the fact that we are far too interconnected culturally, through media, and geographically to afford anything else. If we are able to foster this idea of a nation, then we will be on good foundations for the construction of a new Californian republic, with our energy spent much more usefully on the practicalities of independence rather than on who to exclude and blame for our problems. While it'd be very premature to talk now about the specifics of a future Californian government, there are some basic principles that should guide us here as well. I firmly believe that the hatred which came to define the United States would not have reached its extreme if not for the work of politicians who stoked the flames of division knowing that they would never be able to get into public office on any other merit. The United States came to represent a government fundamentally disconnected from its people, existing for the sake of maintaining power first and foremost and for the benefit of the people only when it coincidentally and temporarily aligned with the interests of those in charge. As such, a fundamental principle of any Californian government must be that of regional autonomy. California is a vast land, spanning from San Diego to the Sierra Nevadas, the Imperial Valley to the Redwood Forest, along with every town, mountain, and region in between. Therefore, it would be a profound mistake to work so hard for independence only to have this land ruled by Sacramento politicians. Regional autonomy and principles of self-governance need to be a core foundation of the Californian government, otherwise we would very quickly alienate large parts of the country we have just created, shattering any Californian identity before it could fully materialize. This regional autonomy should consist of meaningful separations of power between the national and regional governments, allowing room for differences facilitating national cohesion. This system of autonomy should not replicate the states we currently have, as they tend to be laboratories of tyranny far more than laboratories of democracy, replicating the stratified federal government on a miniature scale, tending to monopolize power around a specific group or party. Even the current situation of California does this, with any opposition to the democratic establishment essentially non-existent and the voices of local groups silenced from the top to the bottom. The new California should be one which avoids this. Power should not be unitary, with a national government trampling on local ones, but neither should the local governments be their own miniature national governments. Instead, California should be a web of autonomies, with certain functions delegated to regional governments but the face of California being a united one, a collection of pieces where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Any power delegated to the national government should be done with restraint, answering the question of whether this truly needs to concern the country as a whole. Simultaneously, systems should be in place which actively encourage and facilitate regional cooperation, creating the conditions for a mutually beneficial system which allows for inter-regional investments along with national support. In the federal United States of today, it'd be unthinkable for a highway to be built between Arizona and California without the support of the federal government, with both states separated by iron gates which prevent this sort of cooperation. On the other end of the spectrum, the unitary Chinese government doesn't need to ask permission at all. It could bulldoze 10,000 houses to build a railroad from Chongqing to Shanghai through a central order from the capital. Both of these situations should be avoided, and ironically, despite them being opposite sides of the spectrum on paper, both end up empowering the national government. In the case of China, due to the regions having almost no autonomy, and in the case of the United States because they have so much autonomy that they can't meaningfully function together without federal government stepping in to help. In New California, if a highway was to be built from Modesto to Salinas, it could be done solely through the cooperation of both regional governments, along with the aid of any other regions interested in the project, and perhaps some money set aside by the national government for projects like this. It'd be a system which could elegantly allow for local autonomy, promote national cooperation, and maintain a distinct separation of powers which prevents the national government absorbing powers through necessity. I believe that one mechanism to do this could be through the creation of a regional assembly that acts as a parallel chamber of Congress to a national assembly, serving as a mechanism for regional cooperation. It'd be distinctly different from the Senate of today, as a body that can act within its own bounds to avoid obstructionism while still having the power to review national legislation, though with a higher threshold for blocking legislation entirely. However, this is straying too much into the specifics, and anything else to this effect should be discussed when independence is closer in sight. Another pillar of any new California must be some form of corporate regulation. While I believe that the cause of independence should be a broad one, I also believe that one of the greatest risks for an independent California would be its transformation into a plutocracy, run by tech elites and businessmen who bring in wealth but only for themselves, leaving California as an unaffordable husk existing solely to prop up San Francisco and the Silicon Valley. There needs to be some meaningful mechanism to prevent this. Otherwise, the government of California will inevitably become an extension of powerful corporations, recreating the conditions which brought down the United States. At the same time, we should avoid the unnecessary and excessive bureaucratic regulation which currently paralyzes development in California. The current state government seeks to use top-down regulation as the solution to all problems, ironically worsening many of them by making any government investment almost useless as it is absorbed by bureaucracy and legal complications. As such, I believe that the prevention of corporate tyranny should function in the same way as the regional government's prevention of national tyranny, by being organized primarily from the bottom up with reciprocal support from the national government. Since governments and corporations tend to act as two sides of the same coin, we need to have powerful institutions that prevent either side from going too strong. The fostering of democratic unions, universal workers' protections, and the ability for regional governmental investment to compete with private investments will create the conditions where corporations will have to make reasonable efforts to give back to the community, lest it be rendered obsolete by local initiatives which could accomplish the same things but more democratically. Once again, the independence movement should be a near universal one, and as such I'll leave any more personal opinions for a more mature phase, but I believe that at least these measures could serve as a way to prevent the worst excesses which are currently tearing California apart. Finally, and as a logical conclusion to the previous two pillars, we absolutely need to shatter the two-party duopoly we currently find ourselves in. Some of this can be quite simple, such as ranked choice voting systems and a proportional National Assembly, but it's undeniably important to avoid the stagnation that the Democrats and Republicans have brought. I am, however, quite confident that in the course of the independence we will slowly rid ourselves of these two parties, as I highly doubt they will support us in our efforts until we have already carved out a voice for ourselves. The specific methods to do this, however, transitions quite well into my final point, that being how we are meant to achieve any of this. There is no straightforward path towards independence, and opponents of the cause like to point that out any time it's brought up. It is important to mention, however, that there is rarely a mechanism to liberation other than through one's own initiative. The first concrete step towards the independence is recognizing this fact, and not letting it dampen our efforts but rather embolden them. As such, I will say in plain words that the American Constitution does not allow secession, but since secession is now necessary, we will carve out that path regardless. The first step of all is rallying support, showing people the cause of independence and allowing them to come to their own conclusions surrounding it. We are not in any position to force the issue at the moment, but we must be all the more determined as a result. I believe the independence of California has clear and demonstrable benefits, and I also believe that many people will be receptive of the idea if a serious movement puts it forward. I put emphasis on serious movement, as quite frankly, the various other movements advocating California independence come across as either a joke, delusional, or with some ulterior motive. They will register political parties but do nothing more, running candidates bound to lose in what feels like a bid for attention more than anything else before disappearing until the next election. They will preach about Californian independence, but then completely undermine their credibility by proclaiming that they will abolish the Republican Party or say how integration into Canada is an acceptable alternative to independence. They will model themselves off other political movements, but only follow the surface level appearances, forgetting the depth that is required for a true push towards change. While I will avoid naming names, it is not useful in the slightest, I will mention a current petition circling around which I'd encourage all to sign, as getting the question of independence on the ballot would be an undeniable good, though whose movement has done nothing to help in this regard and has generally neglected the practicalities of publicizing something which they claim is so important. Overall, it is necessary to recognize our currently disadvantageous position, but do everything in our power to meaningfully rectify this rather than willing ourselves into prominence and demanding respect without acting to earn it. The creation of a Californian independence coalition will be one of the next steps towards independence. Our goal should be first and foremost the fostering of the cause of independence rather than focusing on winning seats or running gubernatorial candidates. We must recognize the fact that we cannot compete directly and immediately with the more established parties, and should instead focus on gaining local support that can allow us to have a proper base to build the future movement upon. This is a step that cannot be skipped, and the ignoring of this fact is one of the greatest reasons that third parties inevitably fail in this country. A strong local support system, especially as a regional separatist party, will allow us flexibility and create an alternative fundraising source that doesn't rely on large corporate donors, which we will almost certainly not have access to. Candidates should only be run once we are almost certainly confident that they will win, as there is essentially no reason to spend our energy and funds wrangling for scraps of local town councils when we could be further growing the movement instead. By gaining the support of communities before running candidates, we are both directly connected with the people we are meant to represent and allow for a clear mandate to further the cause of independence. Our goal should be to slowly work up through the layers of government, with our progress always directly corresponding to our direct support on the ground. This is the strategy that successful independence parties have used before, and it is the only way we can hope to gain any sort of influence whatsoever. It's also a strategy that is easily scalable, for even if it takes years for us to firmly win the support of one city, the fact that even a single city in California would be firmly supportive of an openly secessionist party would create a springboard for further progress. From small cities we can work to big cities, going from the mayors of Calexico del Centro, then gradually working our way up to the county level as well. Once we have ourselves established like this, we've already overcome the largest hurdle of all. If we can show that we are a serious movement, if we can show that we can deliver concrete results, and if we can provide an easy and clear way for those sympathetic to join as well, then we have the foundations for something greater. And once these foundations are built, it is only a matter of building up further. The coalition should be a broad tent party, ideally consisting of multiple new and independent political parties which operate on their own as an alternative to the Republicans and Democrats, but all agreeing on the topic of independence. This will have the effect of both allowing internal dissent while keeping the movement united, as well as creating the structure for which the future politics of California can be built upon. This broad characteristic is essential, as even though there are principles we must stand by, we must also recognize the absolute legitimacy of disagreement, and to do otherwise risk the derailing of the movement over petty and temporary disputes. The coalition would act as a united front for the cause of independence, a common forum for our common cause. Parties within the coalition could run their own candidates to represent their interests, but never against other candidates of the coalition. If we achieve moderate electoral success, we can set up a system of internal primaries for running candidates in specific areas. Just as we will survey regions to make sure there's a high chance the coalition candidate will win over the establishment parties, the internal parties could hold surveys to see which party would be more likely to win and then agree to run them under the coalition banner, with a mention of the internal party as well in parentheses. So long as all parties agree on the cause of independence, agree on the basic principles, and agree to never run candidates against one another, then this balance can hold. While I am under no illusion that all internal parties will come to agreement or even stand one another, that is not relevant in the greater cause at hand. Any disagreements can be fought out in the assemblies of a Californian republic, with the energies of today unified by the fact that if we do not succeed together, all of us will lose. With this, we shall create the infrastructure of our new nation within the shell of the old. If this method succeeds, which I have good reason to believe it will, permitting certain flexibility for changes as the true circumstances become clearer, we will then face the final barrier to independence. The Constitution does not permit this sort of action, and the rest of the country will attempt to keep us chained to them even as they look down on our state and hope that we fall into the sea. The reason for this is simple. We are far too important to the economy of the United States to be allowed to leave. Any hatred towards us will not change this fact. This national importance, however, gives us leverage that we must exploit to our advantage. With this national importance as a background, I will explain the escalating scale of action we can take to achieve our ultimate goal of freedom and independence. The legal mechanism for independence would be through a constitutional amendment, and we should strive to achieve this as the simplest and least damaging way to achieve our goal. If we are able to win the legislature and the governorship of the state, we can begin immediately working towards the cause of independence. All of our combined efforts in the Congress should be acting towards this goal, proposing amendments for independence and entering into negotiations with the federal government to this end. Assuming that the Congress is still intact and in an operational form by the time we reach this point, we should attempt to at least begin discussions in good faith in the hope they will allow our independence. If this fails, however, which it likely will, we can adopt more obstructionary tactics to achieve our goal. Just as Sinn Féin did in Ireland, we will begin treating Congress as a hostile entity to which our presence is solely for the purpose of making our voices heard. But unlike Sinn Féin and their abstentionism, we will adopt every obstructionary tactic that is possible to force the issue. While we only have 2 senators, we have dozens of House seats, enough to cause a serious obstruction if we oppose any bill put forward by opponents of independence. We must make ourselves heard to the fullest extent possible, and ensure that the question of independence is never able to be ignored at the federal government at large. Every day we will propose a new bill, every day a new amendment, and we will do our best to grind the federal government to a halt until they take our movement with the seriousness it deserves. Hopefully this is enough to make them see reason, though I admit with the increase in authoritarianism of the federal government, I'm not sure it will be. We might find instead ourselves at odds with the White House, Republicans, and Democrats alike. An unfortunate situation, but one which puts us in the unique situation of being free of their corrupting influence. If this materializes, however, there is still more we can do. A referendum on independence in California would be the next step, one which would be legally non-binding but which would make undeniably clear our position to the whole world. Even though we can't force ourselves into independence, a referendum like this passing would have a destabilizing effect towards the rest of the country in an almost unprecedented way. The largest economy of the nation, openly and decisively declaring their intention to separate from the United States, would shatter international confidence in the country, and create the conditions for the issue to be forced further. After this referendum, we could begin making legal but extremely provocative statements against the federal government. We would take down American flags from government buildings, hold a convention for the structure of a new California republic, and begin entering into informal relations with other countries to gain support from abroad. The message would be clear. You may be able to force us to stay, but forcing our cooperation would be impossible, and we will do everything in our power to make our presence in the United States more damaging than our independence. The federal government's reaction from here will be a turning point in both the history of the United States and California, but as things stand, I believe we should attempt to remain within the bounds of the law until the federal government disregards it entirely. There is always the grim possibility of a federal intervention, one which should be avoided at all costs and which we would likely be unable to repel. However, even at this extreme of tension, we still have the protection of our importance to the United States. Forcibly integrating us after all of this had been done would entail mutually assured destruction, as even though we would likely lose any armed conflict, a California in ruins would do far more damage to the United States than a free California. A California under occupation would mean the end of our movement, but would also mean the end of the United States as any sort of power whatsoever, and would inevitably drive them into a spiral of destruction they can never recover. I believe that for this reason, the United States would like to avoid this outcome as much as we would, though talking any further about this is sheer speculation. Ultimately, I cannot predict the future circumstance and consequences of what's to come. What I can say, however, is that we should not let fear blind us, and we should certainly not fall into a quiet complacency as everything we love is taken from us while a nation falls into darkness. We must act, because doing otherwise is simply surrender. We must take a stand, tempered by reality, but not limited by what is easy. And even if we ultimately fail, we will have stood as a light, shining like a pillar through the darkness from that beautiful golden land.